Well, good morning and welcome to my talk at TPS Virtual. I'm speaking to you from Fujifilm's amazing location in central London, the House of Photography, just between Leicester Square and Covent Garden. So this was a talk we were planning to do on the live stage with me tethering and photographing a beautiful model in a wedding dress, but obviously we can't do that at the minute, so we're talking to you via the powers of the World Wide Web. My name is Scott Johnson, for those that don't know me, and I'm one of Fujifilm's brand ambassadors here in the UK, and it's an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning on getting it right in camera. So my talk is basically, well, getting it right in camera. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I believe that as digital photographers, we fall into the trap of just spraying and praying and just, I'll fix that in Photoshop at a later date, not realizing the level of skill that is sometimes required to master Photoshop, and the gradient and the cloning out and the content aware is fantastic, but it doesn't always get it right. So I'm a great believer in getting things as much in camera as possible. Not just retouching purposes, but also the exposure for our outcome and how we're going to present the files, whether it be digitally or in print. Now, I'm a great believer in print, so we have to make sure that the exposure is right, so the printers that we're using can look as best as we can and provide our work to look amazing. Now, I'm a shooter of Fujifilm, obviously. I use X-T3s and the GFX 50Ss at weddings that I'm photographing. So the level of file that I'm getting straight out of camera is generally very, very, very good. But sometimes we do have to tweak certain things, pull shadows out, recover highlights. But then again, that's how we're getting things right in camera. It's knowing the outcome and knowing what our final product is going to be, so we can know how we can manipulate the file from getting it right in camera to the final product. And I'll show you a version of that as we get down the line. So, as I said, let's get things right in camera. Now, normally, as I said, I'd be photographing a model, so you'd be seeing my crop and my exposure, but this talk today is really about file preparation and how we can get things perfect as an outcome. But one of the main benefits of getting things right in camera, getting the images perfect in camera at the point of capture, is because we can spend more time working on the business rather than in the business. And that's really important. I think, especially now, we don't have time, well, wedding photographers, we have a lot of time in a minute. It's just a question of we can spend more time on marketing, getting our social media ready, rather than spending hours and hours and hours in Photoshop, really trying to, get our head around getting this fire escape sign out, or getting the fire extinguisher out, or trying to pull too much out the shadows, or trying to recover too much in the highlights. And it's spending time where I'm a better photographer than I'm a marketer. So I need to work more on my marketing than I do on my photography. And that's the most important thing at the minute. So if I can spend less time in Photoshop and Lightroom with layer adjustments and layer masks and brushes, and more time working on my business, or if I'm honest, in the pub with my friends, I'd much rather do that. So this is why we're going to be speaking about getting things as right as we possibly can in our camera. But most of all, it's time. How often have we said, I'll just fix that in post-production? How often have we fallen into the trap of, I'll do a quick 5-minute retouch on this file here, and end up spending 4 hours trying to get rid of something just for the sake of exposing it properly, removing something in Photoshop, even for the sake like this lapel mic I'm wearing now. I've done weddings before now where I've forgotten the groom's had it on, and the retouch has come back in, can we please remove the lapel mic from the pictures, purely because I forgot to take it off, put it in his pocket, or give it back to the videographer. And that's taken a lot of time to get that in every shot that goes into the wedding album. So for a 2-second fix, it's taken me hours to retouch that out. So it's things like that. We're not just talking about exposure. A lot of my talk will be on exposure, but it's also the little things that we need to focus on and make sure that we, again, save time. We don't want to be spending hours and hours and hours in post-production when we could be out photographing and earning more money. The other side of it is, by getting our exposure correct in camera, is we're going to get better files. We're going to get better files which we can print from, which we can, if you're looking at the work that I produce in my wedding books, they're 80 centimeters wide in some cases. So we need really, really good files to produce the best quality print from that file. And if we're shooting constantly 3 stops overexposed or 8 stops underexposed, we're going to be taking the file to a place where it's not comfortable, and we're going to start seeing things breaking up. We're going to start seeing banding. We're going to start seeing artifacting. We're going to start seeing a lot of different things within the file that we could easily rectify just by getting it right in camera and just by making sure the exposure is perfect for our outcome. And again, we'll come on to that at a later date. For those of you that don't know artifacting is what's commonly known as banding, and it's where you start seeing the grade of the file. Let's say we have a beautiful sunset shot and you print it and you can see the layers and the levels in the tone that's coming through. People say, oh, that's banding. Banding is a print problem. It's not a file problem. Artifacting is where the integrity of the file literally can't cope with the tone that we are producing, which is why if we're printing, ideally, we want to be shooting in RAW and producing 16-bit TIFFs, and that really helps the file quality if you're going to bigger files at the end of the day. Now, personally, for the images that I'm shooting, I generally shoot a lot of my work in JPEG because the Fujifilm JPEGs are absolutely superb, especially off my GFX system. However, if I know that I am going to be producing something for a piece of wall art like this, or something that's really, really big that's going to go on a wall or on a display, then I will keep the RAW file back and I will produce that Adobe 98 RGB file that is a 16-bit TIFF, because I know that there'll be no artifact in there whatsoever. But that's a complete sidetrack of what we're talking about today anyway. So better files will give us better results, and at the end of it, because we're getting better results, we should be getting more bookings and therefore more money. So it's about controlling the quality of the work that we're doing at the point of capture, which is why we're talking about getting things right in camera. And as I said, better results. If we get better results, how often have you seen a print on a web or on a phone and you say, that's really, really good, but you've got the print back and you're like, oh, that's actually not that great. And you're disappointed because on a screen, it looks perfect, but on print, it doesn't look anywhere near as good. Now, I print everything that I produce for my wedding couples, so it has to be perfect because we want to give that level of wow. When our couples are going through their wedding album and they're looking through the book and they're being blown away by the quality of the file, it's because I haven't had to manipulate it to a point where the integrity of the file is breaking up. And that comes down to exposure, that comes down to cropping, that comes down to I'm not having to straighten my files too much, I'm not pulling information out of the file where I have to do. It's just getting things right, and we are going to get a better result as a quality. It's much better. So how we do it is we get the perfect exposure. Now, we're not talking level of highlight to shadow and across the board. As I said, a lot of the work that I do, I will recover shadows, I will recover highlights, but I know down the road when I'm taking at the point of capture my outcome. I'm not going to think, I'll take a picture and think, oh, I'll worry about that later. I know exactly how my files are going to be presented at the point of capture. So I know I shoot to print, so I'm shooting from a print head-on. I'm shooting to know that what I can pull out of the files will look good in print, because as I said before, we know that a lot of the images that we're producing will generally be viewed on an iPad or on a screen or on a phone, but I want my images to look perfect on a print. So I'll make sure that my exposure is absolutely nailed for printing. So how do I do that? Again, I shoot on the Fujifilm X-T3 and the GFX 50S. So I've got both cameras set up pretty much the same way, but generally I'll shoot in aperture priority on both. But what I will do is I will leave the exposure compensation dial on the top of both cameras to the C setting. Now, for those of you that don't know, on the Fujifilm system, we can dial in and we'll get 3 stops above and beyond the exposure that the camera's given us. But on C, on the custom setting, we can actually get 5 stops of exposure by using the front and the back dials. Now, I've got a graphic here which hopefully should pop up now, and it will show you the buttons that I use and how I do it. So literally, I keep the top dial on C, and I will use my thumb and my finger to dial in the exposure. So the camera will give me an exposure. I'm on auto white balance generally. Sometimes I will change it depending on where I am. If I'm in daylight or I'm doing speeches in a venue, I will manually white balance the white balance in from there. But generally the ISO will be on auto, but I'll have a tolerance in my minimum shutter speed and my maximum ISO that I'm happy to print at, which is generally 12,800 because again, the Fujifilm system, the high ISO is absolutely fantastic. But then what I will do, the exposure that the camera gives me, I will then oftenly, it's not even a word, I will often override that with what I know will print better. Again, that just comes with experience. It comes with knowing what I can pull out of the file. But then again, the benefit of having a mirrorless system is you can see that when I'm changing the exposure in the EVF that the cameras are giving me, I can see the result. I can see the outcome, and I can see that, and I will know that, yes, it's looking quite dark, but I can pull that out. So I'm getting the exposure right in camera for my outcome. And that's the important thing. Getting it right in camera isn't nailing the exposure perfectly, because when it comes to print, you're always going to have a highlight. You might have a shadow that's going to come out and you have to change in post-production. But then it's spending as least amount of time in post-production as possible. So this is the setup that I use. Obviously I've got it set on a second exposure here, but that's generally not what I shoot. I'm on auto shutter speed, and I will manually adjust my exposure to what I want. So those of you that are shooting mirrorless, as you know, there is an awful lot of information that we have in the viewfinder. I only really care about two things. One is battery level, very, very important, because people say to me, what is the most important thing about a camera? It's not anything, because without the batteries, none of it works. So always, always, always look at your battery levels, because I've been caught out before, not just with Fujifilm, with any system, I've run out of batteries. So that's the first most important thing. The second most important thing is I'm looking at my histogram. Now in the Fujifilm system, you can set the histogram to be in the bottom right-hand corner of the EVF. So I know that when I'm dialing up and down on my exposure, my histogram is moving left and right. So I know what I've got blown out, what I've got, the shadows have just dropped out, but I know what I can pull out and recover in the file. So I know that if I'm shooting a bride and a groom on a very, very sunny day, and I've got a little spike on the right-hand side, it's probably a tiny highlight on the dress, but the faces and everything else is exposed perfectly, and it's looking right in camera. So although I trust my EVF immensely, I'll always have that histogram on the bottom right-hand corner, just as a verification that I know how underexposed or overexposed my image is across the board. And I will use that when I'm looking back at the culling of the images, and in Lightroom, you can see the same histogram on the right-hand side, and I'll know that it's absolutely perfect for how I want it and my outcome to be. So how I expose my images is really down to the setting which I'm in. Now, it's very easy to just put it on center weight and just say, right, I'll let the camera do everything. But then generally to how I get my shadows and my highlights to how I want it, I will generally shoot on spot metering. I will spot meter and get my exposure lock, and then I would change everything in from there. So it's just how I've just become over years and years of shooting to get what I want, to get how the images I want to look in right in camera for the perfect edit. So the picture you can see here is taken in a very, very messy bedroom at a venue not too far from me back in Essex. But because I've spot metered, you throw all of that out. It saved my retouching time, it saved my editing time, and it saved my cropping time, because I'm not having to worry about the mess and the detritus that's in the background of the half-drunk Prosecco glass and the bride and the bridesmaid robes that's just been flung across the bed. We've all been there, it's happened. I spend half my life tidying up after people when I'm at weddings. So by spot metering and getting the exposure right in camera, it means that my retouching and the ability to move things afterwards has now been reduced dramatically. Also, what you can't see here in the background is the lamp. You can't see, if you're looking at the print here on the bottom right-hand side, there's a wooden beam, which you can't see because I've spot metered, and the exposure off this bride's cheek has thrown everything else out, and it is exactly what I want it to be. Because again, I know my outcome. I know that we're going to get things right in camera for the print and the wedding album down the road. So doing a spot meter here, it means that the skylights that you see as the diagonal lines across the top and the center of the image are a little bit darker than a bride's face. I want my attention to go straight into the bride, and as a setting, this is how I want it to look like. And I'm really pleased with the result here, just from spot metering and slightly overriding the exposure on my camera from here. Again, another spot metered shot here. This was a very, very windy day back in October, back when we were allowed to photograph weddings. This was something that I wanted to try and achieve. And it was a bit of an accident, if I'm honest. The shot that we did here, I wanted this striking portrait of the bride that popped up. And it was a very, very windy and very, very blustery day. And at the point of capture, the wind just came across from the right to the left, blew the veil, but had already exposed for the brightest point of the image. So I knew that everything was going to be in tolerance. And what that did, by exposing for the brightest point, that darkened the clouds down behind her naturally. There is no Photoshop here whatsoever. I've just literally turned it to black and white and put a small crop on it. That was it. This is basically in camera as you can possibly get. Because, again, I don't want to be spending time in Photoshop, blurring stuff in, using an adjustment brush and darkening down and lightening things up. This is in camera as possibly can get because I spot metered. So spot metering, it takes a while to master, but once you master it, is the best way of getting that exposure absolutely perfect. So if I'm looking at my histogram here, it's exactly where I want it to be. I've got no blown out highlights, I've got no dropped out shadows, so I know that if I do want to pull anything out of the shadows or reduce the highlight ever so much slightly on her wedding dress, I can do that without it breaking the integrity of the file. One thing I experiment when I'm shooting in camera is movement. Now, movement is very easy to obviously put in post-production, but look closely and it looks very, very fake. So the best thing about the Fujifilm mirrorless system is the ability to shoot on a much lower shutter speed when you're handheld. Now, I shoot X-T3 comfortably, 15th of a second that I can shoot handheld. Now, with the addition of the X-T4, with the IBIS in body stabilization, you can probably get down to about an 1/8 of a second. When I was photographing on the X-H1, I was down at 1/8 of a second handheld with beautifully pin sharp images. So just by getting a bride to walk slowly in front of you, you can create a natural movement in camera rather than the older clip, the marquee elliptical selection in Photoshop, feather it by 200, motion blur. It's obvious it's done in Photoshop. So by getting it in camera, it's a much more natural way of shooting. So this was the second image that I did from a wedding that we shot last year. So again, by creating the scene, asking the bride to move, this is probably a 15th of a second handheld. Again, nice wide stance, bring your body, arms nice and close into the body, and hold your breath. And then take this, because you're breathing, the option is to move the camera in from there. So just by holding your breath, wider stance, bringing your arms into the body, you can create a much more natural looking image with movement that way. Now, this is an image that we took with a silhouette. Now, going back to what we said at the start, I could spend hours and hours and hours in Lightroom and Photoshop by adjustment layers and brushes and trying to bring everything out. This image, you can probably agree, looks okay as a silhouette, but now I could fake it and bring the bride out. I've done that here, and yes, I've brought her out, but it doesn't look very natural because we've gone from almost nothing as far as the histogram's concerned into using my adjustment brush and layer masking to bring all the detail back. Now, we've gone from pretty much black and brought this bride out from a silhouette. So the Fujifilm file can do it, but it doesn't look very, very natural. So in this image, this was the image we took actually only a few weeks ago during lockdown of a family portrait. Now, I knew that my outcome was going to be a print for the wall. So I exposed for the brightest part of the image, but given the time of day, you probably can't see it on your screen here, but there is detail everywhere in this file because my histogram told me that it was. In the first shot of the bride, the histogram was spiked at the black level because there was no detail there, but we managed to pull it out with the file. So again, using a bit of Photoshop, this was the outcome of the file. just by knowing what I can pull out of the file because I got the image correct in camera for my outcome. And that's the important thing, knowing the outcome and knowing what you can pull out of the file in post-production and not just going, oh, I'll do it, and just think of it as a whim. Now, going back to the bride shot, what I could have done was add light in. I could have bought some off-camera flash. Hands up, I'm no good at off-camera flash, therefore I don't do it. If I can't be good at something, I don't want to do it. So I have the utmost respect of photographers that can do off-camera flash. I can't do it. I've tried and I'm rubbish at it, therefore I don't use it. I much prefer posing and crafting my images to light that I can see. So therefore I use LED panels, I use an ice light, I use a little Photix in-pocket light that I use for wedding days because I much prefer crafting my work to light that I can see. So as you can see here, we've got a beautiful setting this is the Guildhall in Coventry. This is a shoot we did back in November, and I've exposed for the highlight. But as you can see, our model there is a complete darkness. Now, I could have used a flash. I could have flashed it and it would have been brilliant, but I'd have got a really harsh shadow on the right-hand side of this image. So what we've done, brought my stunning assistant in, and we've used an LED light, and you can see here that we've actually used the light to focus and bring the exposure of our model back up to where we want it to be. So now the image is exposed perfectly. Now, obviously, we haven't left it like this, so we've just used the first image to Photoshop and put over Abs here, my assistant, on the day, and this was the final image. But we got it right in camera. We got it right. We got the exposure absolutely perfectly in camera. Another shot here from the wedding day. This was an in-camera capture. In camera, and I wanted the focus to go onto the groom in the background here, but it was hard to do. I thought about doing it in post-production. I thought about doing it with a layer mask or an adjustment brush in Lightroom to bring his detail back out, but as you saw from the image of the bride, it can look very, very false. So how did we do this image here? Well, it's in camera. We got the groomsman second from the right to hold an LED panel behind his back to shine light back into the groom. So this, again, is an in-camera capture. So the image looks something like this. So basically, this is how we did it. So, you know, I never let daylight in on magic, but when we're talking about getting things right in camera, we have to let daylight in on magic. So this is how we can do it, by getting our grooms to be light stands, getting our brides to become reflectors with their wedding dress, and this is how we get things right in camera. I can't stress how much the business has improved because I'm spending less time in Photoshop and more time on marketing because I'm doing things properly in camera. So I urge you, in this time of lockdown and this time of, well, as social photographers, we don't really have that much on at the minute, get out and practice. Get out on your family, get out on your loved ones, and you let them be models for you, and work on getting your exposure right in camera by getting everything to know your outcome, know the finished product. Are you shooting for print? Are you shooting for the USB? Are you shooting for wall art? Are you shooting for websites? If you know the outcome, you know how to expose for it properly, and by getting it right in camera, your files will be better as a result. If you've got any questions or want to reach out to me after this live talk comes off the air, this is my Instagram. Please feel free to reach out and contact me. I'm going to be answering questions on live now. So if you want to know anything, please ask. There's no such thing as a stupid question. You might get a stupid answer. That's just my sense of humour coming through. But you know, I'm here to help. I'm here to advise and use the benefit of my 15 years experience into help making your pictures better. It's been a real privilege to be speaking to you here today from the House of Photography here in London, and I look forward to seeing you at a trade show very soon.